Syria. Emperor Augustus has ushered in an age of stability and peace. Cities across the Mediterranean are thriving, and trade with the East is booming. However, the empire has set its new sights, the lands east of the Rhine, inhabited by the Germanic tribes. The Romans are trying to subdue the region stretching from the Rhine to Elbe rivers, which today is the Netherlands, most of Germany, and a sliver of the Czech Republic. However, the barbarians led by Arminius, a local prince serving in the Roman military, staged a brilliant rebellion that completely wiped out the Roman forces. Arminius was able to convince the Roman leader, Varus, to march his men into the Kalkreis and Teutoburg forests. The Germans ambushed them there and slaughtered them. 3 legions, or around 16,000 men, were wiped out, making it one of the most crippling defeats ever in Roman history. Upon hearing the news, the Emperor Augustus reputedly wandered around his palace screaming, "Give me back my legions, Varus!" Several hundred years later, the same Germanic barbarians tore down the Roman Empire, creating the modern Europe we know today, with countries like Spain, France, and England. So it really begs the question, what if the Romans were never crushed at Teutoburg or Wald and conquered Germania? What would culture be like? What would borders be like? What would the world be like? Those are the questions of this alternate history. This timeline could start in countless ways, each with the same effect. There were Germanic chieftains loyal to Varus, who warned him to not trust Arminius, and that Arminius was planning a revolt, but he ignored them because he trusted Arminius too much. He could have fired or killed Arminius in this situation. Arminius orchestrated revolts in the north of Germany to force Varus to march to the Teutoburg, and Varus could have decided to return to winter camps in the Rhine and deal with the issue after winter. Arminius could have just not been born either. Either way, we have a situation in which the Roman army is not butchered in the north of Germany and they're allowed to continue their occupation. As of 9 AD, the conquest of Germania was remarkably placid. There were no major battles, and it was more of an occupation than an actual war. This is part of the reason Teutoburg or Wald was so effective. It completely caught the Romans off guard, when they were lulled into a false sense of security. So the campaign of conquest would continue. Roman forts and towns would be built across the Rhine, and the region would experience more and more Roman culture. There would undoubtedly be native revolts. However, without the genius leadership of Arminius to rally the German tribes together, alongside planning a brilliant ambush in the forest, these would be crushed in the same way a man crushes bugs with a fly swatter. The new Roman frontier would be the Elbe, not the Rhine. Just minor Roman settlement east of the Rhine would have major effects on history. The tribes here are the grandparents of the nations that took over the world. For example, Arminius's tribe, the Cherusci, were the ancestors of both the Franks and the Saxons, who founded France and England. Now imagine the butterfly effects if the Romans were to burn down the Cherusci villages upon hearing about Arminius's plans to revolt. People tend to have several geographic misconceptions when they deal with the Roman conquest of Germania, or even what Germania was at the time. First things first, Emperor Augustus did not want the conquest of the entirety of Germania, simply because that would have been insane. The Slavs were out of the picture at this point somewhere in the woods of northern Russia, and so the Germans sprawled deep into Poland, Byelorussia, western Ukraine alongside the Scandinavian countries. This got even worse after 200 AD, when the Germans settled east in Romania, almost all of Ukraine, and even some of the tribes of the Caucasus became somewhat Germanized. Conquering all this territory would have been physically impossible for the Romans. Also, Emperor Augustus was conscious of how big the empire was, and the real danger of overstretch. On his deathbed, he told his successor that he needed to keep the empire at its current size, because becoming any larger would be foolhardy. Augustus understood that to attempt the conquest of all of Germania would be madness, and so did not try it. The invasion of Germany was likely a ploy to move the frontier eastwards away from Gaul, which was one of the wealthiest and most prosperous provinces of the empire. When the Romans conquered Gaul 60 years earlier, it was suffering from crippling Germanic invasions, and thus a repeat of this was likely a fear of Augustus's. After the Elbe, the next important river to the east is the Oder, which the Romans might advance to, but I frankly don't see a reason to do so, and I think the Romans would definitely see the fear of the overstretch. The issue is that Germany was a province unlike any other the Romans had ever dealt with. There was simply nothing there. The native tribes were incredibly lightly settled, and still lived in a semi-nomadic lifestyle. The land was almost entirely forest. Caesar, when he invaded, marched 8 days without seeing an end to the forest or any inhabitants. There were obviously no towns whatsoever. The Celtic regions the Romans had conquered earlier were actually surprisingly advanced. Gaul had a population of 6 million, while Italy had 7, and Gaul had thriving trade and handicrafts. Britain, meanwhile, had a pretty high population density with 3 million people, a higher number than it did in the 14th century after the Black Death. All the Celtic peoples were based around central hill forts with fairly developed government systems. The Germans, meanwhile, were nearly libertarian wandering tribes that had nothing worth seizing. The Romans would have to build everything from scratch. This would involve an incredible amount of investment. Meanwhile, the frontier would be even further away from the population centers in Italy and Gaul, making it even more difficult to maintain. A very prescient example of what would happen in this timeline would be what was going on at the exact same time in China with the Han dynasty fighting against the Hunnish nomads. China had been facing threats from the Xiongnu nomads of Central Asia, and the Han emperors decided to do something about it. After bribing the nomads for several generations, they decided to fight them. They waged an all-out war against the nomads. After horrendously bloody wars, they were able to drive the nomads north of China's borderlands into the wastes of Mongolia and Siberia. The Chinese then spread further west, even into what is today Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. The Han control of these areas was brief and lasted less than 100 years because the lands in the west were so lightly populated, massive, and difficult to conquer. They required huge amounts of cost and men to subdue and were incredibly far from the central government. The climate of the region was simply so alien from that of eastern China that Han settlers were unable to subdue the land and assimilate the natives. Meanwhile, when the nomadic tribes of Central Asia were able to regain their strength, they became simply impossible to hold. The struggles for these western territories were so expensive that they resulted in huge internal strife inside China. China collapsed into a huge civil war around the birth of Christ, caused mainly by the strain of the empire, which resulted in the loss of the western provinces themselves. Large parts of the Chinese military became dependent on nomadic auxiliaries later. As central authority fell apart, the nomads were able to conquer the northern plain of China itself. There are, of course, differences between Rome and China. China is significantly more isolationist than Rome, and the Germanic tribes themselves were very different from the Hunnish horse nomads, but the comparison still stands. Both the Han dynasty and Rome were states that conquered everything that made sense to conquer. Rome, however, was able to stay within relatively good boundaries, while China overstretched itself trying to conquer inhospitable barbarian lands. In this timeline, like China, we would see Rome pour more and more resources into trying to hold down Germania. Roman settlers would be moved in, there would be forays east of the Elbe to deal to savage tribes outside Rome's control, devastating blows that would inevitably fail. The Roman Golden Age, built upon stable frontiers that didn't need a lot of energy to maintain, thus there were less taxes, more trade, and a higher standard of living, would have a serious rusty tilt to it. With Rome putting so much effort into Germany, the Romans would never have invaded Britain. Britain was invaded because Emperor Claudius needed a victory to show that he was a real emperor, and not some stuttering fool. The empire was fairly stable, and Britain would be a relatively easy conquest. Since the British Empire was the largest in history, this would have enormous effects on the world. However, I've already made a video on this topic, the link to which is in the description. The general gist of it is that England remains Celtic, like Scotland or Ireland in our world, but under Roman influence, the southeast of England still develops to be the most advanced area, and still conquers the rest of the British Isles. Over the next few centuries, the Germanic tribes would become even more developed and more threatening to the Roman Empire. Partly this was caused by the invasion of the Yazygiz nomadic tribes into Central Europe, which created a chain effect of migrations and wars that forced the Germanic tribes to unite into larger and stronger tribes. Partly it was caused by Rome using more and more Germanic tribes in their military, which meant that the military-technological gap shrunk to nothing, and partly improved agricultural methods meant that the tribes' numbers grew greatly. These semi-nomadic libertarian tribes I was talking about earlier became powerful kingdoms in their own right. This would be even worse in this timeline. In China, the Han involvement in the grasslands created a string of nomadic kingdoms that received Chinese technology and influence. Chinese artisans migrated north into the tribes to escape Chinese taxes and for new opportunities. These civilized tribes became more dangerous than the more barbaric ones because they knew how to play the civilized world's games. In later dynasties, the Great Wall existed as much to keep the Chinese from migrating north, and thus spreading Chinese technology as much to keep the nomads out. This would happen in this timeline, with the tribes west of the Elbe taking up Roman technology but never assimilating, making a very deadly brew. The crisis of the 3rd century was in our timeline when 1/3 of the Roman Empire's population died due to a combination of barbarian invasion, civil war, and plague. This would be even worse in this timeline. When the last good emperor, Marcus Aurelius, would die in 180, the lands east of the Rhine would split off and the empire would collapse into even more vicious barbarian invasions than our timeline. It's highly probable that the Western